Welcome, everyone, to another Silicon Labs product podcast. I'm excited today to have Daniel Misoph join me. Daniel actually was playing in that instrumental that we heard at the beginning. He's part of that rock band. He plays a mean guitar. But more impressively, Daniel, he knows a lot about Silicon Labs products. He's our FAE in the German area, and he brought something to my attention. He's recently, as all of us, has been trying to deal and understand the environment that we're living in with the COVID situation. And so Daniel took some time, he read some papers, and came up with a lot of great ideas, and he shared them with me. So I thought I'd have him join me on this podcast. Daniel, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, why don't you start the podcast by talking to the listeners about what you found? It sounded like you found some interesting articles.
Yeah, as Kyle mentioned, I was reading some articles. So in Germany, the schools were about to reopen, and there were articles about how to properly ventilate the classroom with all these children in it, and to prevent the COVID spread happening. And especially indoors, this is a problem because most of the COVID particles are spread airborne. So just by breathing in the same room, the spread might happen. And so the baseline of this article was that you could use CO2 level for estimating when to ventilate the room. Typically outdoors, you have a level of 400 ppm, and so the main recommendation of this article was to keep it below 800 ppm indoors. So once the level reaches 800, you should open the window and do ventilation.
So I'm not surprised at all. I'm assuming that you immediately after you read that started thinking of ways that the Silicon Labs products could help solve those problems. So what did you find? What did you immediately apply to that article?
Yeah, so of course I started thinking about it. I mean, we have a lot of great development platforms out there. I immediately thought about the Thunderboard Sense because it's feature-packed. It's suitable for low-powered sensors because a lot of sensors are already on board. So my first pick would be the BG22 Thunderboard, but unfortunately it doesn't have a CO sensor on board. But we have another Thunderboard, which is the Thunderboard Sense 2, and it does have RTH sensor, so temperature sensor, and air quality gas sensor on it. It's the CCS 811. And this is the perfect fit for such an application. Low power, sensor on board, battery powered, and that's all you need.
So you mentioned it had that AMS, the CCS 811. What exactly, how does that interface with our chip? You mentioned the Thunderboard Sense had our Bluetooth device. How do they interconnect, and is there any configuration that you needed to do?
Yeah, basically this sensor does have an I2C interface. All you need to do is basically configuring the application to trigger this sensor each so and so seconds, and then the result can be read out via I2C, and then you can just do in the application what you want with the result.
And I've actually taken the app.c that you provided, Daniel, and we'll put that link in our podcast so other people can download it. So it's pretty creative. You have the Thunderboard Sense turn on. It establishes the room's carbon emissions, and so it'll establish a baseline. The lights will be normal. I think they're green. And then if that particle count reaches above that threshold you talked about, they turn red, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's exactly the idea. So at 400, which you remember is the outdoor typical level of CO2 concentration. So it starts at 400 ppm with green. And if it goes around about to 800, then the LEDs will be just red.
Yeah, and I found it cool. So then I opened up my Thunderboard app on my cell phone, and I connected with the board. And sure enough, as you said, the particles per million or whatever went through the roof. So it's pretty impressive. Great idea, and I'm sure there's more tuning people can do, and there's more technology they can put into it. But as you said, customers can get started right away using our Thunderboard. There's not much more they need to at least start evaluation. So that was pretty cool. What are some of the other things that you've thought about? I know that being an engineer, you started with what we have. What are some other ideas that you've thought about that customers that are trying to create COVID type contact sensor type applications? What other ideas do you have in your head?
Yeah, as an engineer, I'm always driven by problems to solve. So if there's a problem, I'm immediately looking for a solution for it. And of course, you can use the sensors on board perfectly for any kind of problem. So we do have the optical sensors. You can have magnetic sensors. You can also measure the position, so like with a 6-axis accelerometer, and you can also measure temperature and humidity. So almost any task can be implemented using this Thunderboard evaluation platform. You just have to be creative. So yeah. Depending on the problem, you can come up with an individual solution.
Well, so you mentioned the Thunderboard. How do customers get started with the Thunderboard? And then maybe talk about if there's an example project or things like that help them get started.
Yeah, that's actually one benefit of the Thunderboard 22 or Thunderboard 2. They're cheap, so they're only $20, I think. And we do also already have a lot of example projects out there in Simplicity Studio. So the customer can just install Simplicity Studio, hook the board up, and it will immediately display several example apps. And one of them is the Thunderboard example app, which also my example is based on, or my small project is based on. And I use this as a starting point and modified from there. And all the good thing is all the sensor interaction is already implemented, and you can just start using it.
Well, that's great. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll put that one file that you made the modifications to in the details of this podcast. So if a listener has access to a Thunderboard, if they go out and purchase the Thunderboard Sense 2, then they can download that app.c. As you mentioned, all they have to do is plug in that Thunderboard, and our IDE will immediately identify it, and it'll list example projects. And as you mentioned, the Thunderboard app will show up there. They open that up, replace the one file, and it was real quick for me to start seeing what you did. So I encourage our listeners to get a Thunderboard, download the app.c, and see the work that you did. It was really great.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Daniel, too, for you to join me today. And thanks for reaching out to me. As I mentioned via email, we'll work to get this out to the masses because this is an important part of our community, and everyone's dealing with the COVID. And the fact that you came up with this great way to have companies start thinking about air quality was really quick and timely. So I thank our listeners for continuing to show interest in our podcast episodes, and I look forward for our next episode. Until then, stay safe, everyone.